Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. It's great to have you here. I know that some of you probably will be joining us later when you have time. I know 9 o'clock in the morning can be uh, not possible for many people to listen. So thank you for joining us later. Um, so this morning we're going to be talking about chapter three. And as I indicated, chapter three, of all the books that I've read, all the chapters that I've gone through, chapter three is one of my most favorite chapters I've ever read in any book. So hopefully that will be the same for you. I don't want to oversell it, but it's just a wonderful. It's one of those kinds of chapters that give you a great aha moment. And I think even though Lewis may not have intended it as much, but to give you some deep insight about maybe the nature of who we are and the nature of the place that those of us who are believers are going to. So where are we? So far, the main character it was in Greytown, and Greytown is this very miserable, almost dark, not quite dark place. It's vast, it's enormous, it's dreary, it's cold. No one gets along with each other. And so he finds himself on this bus queue waiting for people to just waiting there and not sure why. And this bus comes out of the sky and lands, and it's blazing and it's glorious, and people get in the bus, and they fight, they bicker, they don't get along, and the main character meets two other primary characters, one of which is a young, he's described as a tasseled haired poet who's really a communist. And then later he meets another person who is a kind of like a hyper capitalist, and they describe the nature of who they are, and you can see the deficiencies in their character. And then, of course, he has a conversation with a person who describes Greytown in kind of furtive way. Not only do people not get along, but there's this impending sense of danger, as if everything is about to become night. And um, and so um, and so there's this sense in which something is going to happen, and they're afraid. And so anyway, they're on this bus and they keep ascending for just seems like a long time, and the city below seems vast and enormous, and where some people live actually uh, hundreds of light years away from each other. It's that big. And so they keep ascending, and he has the main character has more conversation. And so I'm going to pick up towards the end of chapter two, so that you get this sense of them leaving this dreary, almost dark, damp, dismal, depressing place. uh, and so I want you to get this sense of transition from this to where they're going. So this is the end of chapter two. Hours later, there came a change. It began to grow light in the bus. The grayness outside the windows turned from mud colored to mother of pearl, then to faintest blue, then to a bright blueness that stung the eyes. We seemed to be floating in a pure vacancy. There were no lands, no sun, no stars in sight, only the radiant abyss. So they're still rising. I let down the window beside me. Delicious freshness came in for a second, and then, "What the hell are you doing?" shouted the intelligent man, leaning roughly across me and pulling the window sharply up. You want us all to catch our death of a cold? Hit him a bit, said the big man. I glanced round the bus. Though the windows were closed and soon muffed, the bus was full of light. It was cruel light. It shrank from the faces and forms by which it was surrounded. They were all fixed faces, full not of possibilities, but impossibilities. Some gaunt, some bloated, some glaring with idiotic ferocity, some drowned beyond recovery in dreams, but all, in one way or another, distorted and faded. One had a feeling that they might fall to pieces at any moment if the light grew much stronger. Then there was a mirror at the end wall of the bus. I caught sight of my own, and still the light grew. So here we come to chapter 3 then, and you get this magnificent picture of his first encounter on the outer perimeter of heaven itself. A cliff had loomed up ahead. It sank vertically beneath us, so far that I could not see the bottom, and it was dark and smooth. We were mounting all the time. At last the top of the cliff became visible like a thin line of emerald green, stretched tight as a fiddle string. And so, they've come out of this dark abyss and they keep going up and up and up. And so the light gets greater and greater, and they begin to see each other as they really are. And above them, he looks and he can see this thin green line, which would be the where the chasm that they're in, that would be the end. That's where they're going to emerge from. That green line will get bigger and bigger. So presently, we glided over that top. We were flying above a level, grassy country through which there ran a wide river. We were losing height now. Some of the tallest treetops were only 20 feet below us. Then, suddenly, we were at rest. Everyone had jumped up. Curses, taunts, blows, a filth of um, vituperation was so just all just people just again like Greytown, they didn't get along there, they're not getting along here, and for no reason they're just violent with each other, both in words and physically. They're irascible. They can't get along. So a filth of vituperation came to my ears as my fellow passengers struggled to get out. A moment later, they had all succeeded. I was alone in the bus, and through the open door, there came to me in the fresh stillness the singing of a lark. I got out. The light and coolness that drenched me were like those of summer morning, early morning, a minute or two before sunrise, only that there was a certain difference. And so, this theme of in the gray town being almost completely dark, and in heaven here, where they are, almost being fully daylight. It wasn't quite, just short of that. I had the sense of being in a larger space, perhaps even a larger sort of space than I had ever known before, as if the sky were further off and the extent of the green plain wider than they could be on this little ball of earth. I had got out in some sense, which made the solar system itself seem an indoor affair. And so he's saying that this expanse is so great. It's as if the entire solar system could fit in this vast expanse. And so you begin to see that this expanse in heaven is even greater than the expanse that they emerged from below. It gave me a feeling of freedom, but also of exposure, possibly of danger, which continued to accompany me uh, through all that followed. It is the impossibility of communicating that feeling, or even of inducing you to remember it as I proceed, which makes me despair of conveying the real quality of what I saw and heard. At first, of course, my attention was caught by my fellow passengers, who were still grouped about in the neighborhood of the omnibus, though beginning, some of them, to walk forward into the landscape with hesitating steps. And this is one of the more profound pieces here in the book that I'm about to read to you. I gasped when I saw them, not that they were in the light. I'm sorry, now that they were in the light, they were transparent, fully transparent. When they stood between me and it, smudgy and imperfectly opaque, when they stood in the shadow of some tree, they were in fact ghosts, man-shaped stains on the brightness of that air. One could attend to them or ignore them at will, as you do with the dirt on a window pane. So I just want to read this again because what the main character, Lewis, is describing here is he's describing what people actually look like in the light of heaven. The density of that light, even though it wasn't full morning yet, the density of that light and how it penetrated their very essence. And so the substance, the full substance of what they really look like in heaven is explained here. I gasped when I saw them. Now that they were in the light, they were transparent, fully transparent, when they stood between me and it, that is the light, smudgy and imperfectly opaque when they stood in the shadow of some tree. So you could barely perceive them. In the light of heaven, uh, because of its fullness and because of their insubstantiality, they were barely perceptible in the so their image, what was left of them in comparison to heaven, gave them this quality. They were in fact ghosts, man-shaped stains on the brightness of that air. One could attend to them or ignore them at will, as you do with the dirt on a window pane. So picture in your mind, if you have dirt on your window pane, and probably most of us do, you don't even hardly notice it. I mean, it's barely perceptible. And that is the quality of these people. So when they were in Greytown, they seemed fully intact, solid. But when they moved from Greytown and stood in the light of heaven, the brilliance of that light showed them for the essence and the substance of what they really were. I noticed, he goes on to say, well, and by the way, I just want to read Psalm 39:6, where King David says, "Man is a mere phantom as he goes to and fro." So King David, even in his time, describes humankind as barely substantial and implied barely substantial in comparison to what? So there must be something out there that's of more substantiality. And so that's what King David is saying in Psalm 39:6. And I can't help but wonder if this was one of the controlling Psalms or passages of scripture that Lewis had in mind when he was creating this world that he created here in the Great Divorce. I noticed that the grass did not bend under their feet. Even the dewdrops were not disturbed. Then some readjustment of the mind or some focusing of my eyes took place. I saw the whole phenomenon the other way round. The men were as they had always been, as all the men I had known had been, perhaps. It was the light, the grass, the trees that were different, made of some different substance, so much solider than things in our country that men were ghosts by comparison. I think he's right. I think that I think that the reason why Jesus could walk on water or walk through walls, it wasn't because he was less substantial. It was because as a divine person uh, that was perfect and fully substantial, that it's this world that's less substantial. That because he's more solid and we are less so, he can walk through walls, he can walk on water effortlessly. So a kind of comparison to that would be, uh, you walking through a cloud of steam or vapor or smoke. Um, it's insubstantial to you. You as a being, you are more solid, and so you can manipulate it. You can walk through it. It doesn't have any ability to impede you whatsoever. And so your ability to walk through steam or smoke or whatever is not unlike God's ability, Jesus' ability, incarnate, to be able to walk through walls, to walk on water, or whatever else he did, because this world is that much less substantial. So, and I think Lewis gives us this magnificent view of just how much greater heaven is than earth. That it's not like heaven is removed from us just a couple of steps. Heaven is beyond our ability to grasp in terms of its superiority, its real substantiality. So here's the other thing that you have to understand: that Adam and Eve, um, were more solid. That the place where this main character landed would have been very familiar to Adam and Eve. That they were just as solid as this world in which they were. And so when they fell, when they rebelled, the fall in our lives has been that great, so that there's hardly anything left of us. And we are deluded in thinking that we are really that substantial. We are not. There has been a fall, and there is a falling. That the world in which we live now, the created order, at one time was so much more substantial than what it is now. And we, its creatures, were so much more substantial than we are now. And we are deluded, just like those people in Greytown, thinking that their nature is sufficient, that it is as it should be, and it is not. Not when you put it in the light of heaven, and it's examined by that light for all of its properties. And when it is, it's found so deficient that in that light, you barely notice it. It's hardly there. There's virtually nothing left. And so that is this world in comparison to heaven. There is hardly anything left. But God, in his providence, in his power, and in his love, intends to restore all of that. So that's what Lewis is getting at here, I think. Before I go any further, let me just read some passages of scripture of what it might look like when we are glorified. because that's important as we get to some other as we get further into the chapter. So this is from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and it's verses 35 through 36, 42 through 44, and 48 through 49. But it's basically, if you go to 1 Corinthians 15, you'll see this discussion that Paul has about those of us who are resurrected. I begin with verse 35. But someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body will they come? How foolish! What you sow does not come to life unless it dies. So will it be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable, it is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. As the earthly man, so are those who are of the earth, and as is the heavenly man, so also are those who are in heaven. And just as we have borne the image of earthly man, so shall we bear the image of heavenly man. So when we die, the image that we have here uh, will be will transcend itself, and we will take on the image of the heavenly man, and that will be important as we get into this chapter. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth have passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city. This is from the book of Revelation, by the way, Revelation 21. And I saw the whole city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. Then this, because this is another component of this place that Lewis creates here in his book. So not only are bodies transformed, but hearts are transformed, lives are transformed, emotions are transformed. So verse 4, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And he who has seated on the throne said, behold, I am making all things new. So it's this newness here that you're going to see in the lives of these characters. Because from at this point on, the main character in the book will encounter or observe a variety of other people and their encounter with heavenly beings. And so it's the job of these heavenly beings to talk these people who just came up out of Greytown, to talk them into believing and staying in heaven. And some of them do, and some of them don't. And you might think, well, that should be a foregone conclusion. And that's the interesting thing about this particular book, because it's not always a foregone conclusion about people choosing to remain in heaven or choosing to remain in hell. And so, there's some interesting ideas, I think, that Lewis presents on behalf of that. So let me just read this again. Then some readjustment of the mind or some focusing of my eyes took place, and I saw the whole phenomenon the other way around. The men were as they had always been, as all the men I had known had been, perhaps. So not just people from Greytown, but people that he had ever known in the whole of his life. It was the light, the grass, the trees that were different, made of some different substance, so much solider than things in our country, that men were ghosts by comparison. One thing I do want to add to this is I mentioned last week about the influence of the great Greek philosophers on Lewis, in particular Plato. And so this, what he's describing here, reminds me of Plato's world of the forms. So I think I explained this last week, but what Plato said was that you have the physical world and you have the heavenly world. And the anything that you see in this physical world is an imperfect representation of a perfect thing that's exactly like it in the heavenly world. So in the heavenly world, there's this perfect place where anything that exists in its perfect form. And that on earth, similar things exist, but they are imperfect. So it is fascinating that, some 400 or 500 years before the birth of Jesus, that you could have a guy named Plato who could come up with this idea of heaven that, in many respects, is so incredibly accurate. Uh, in Reformed theology, we say that we would say that's that's the that's the residue of God's imageness in us. That there are still certain things we can kind of sort of know about heaven because the image of God still informs us in that kind of a way. In any case, I think that Lewis probably borrowed from Plato to come up with this world, and it's helpful. I mean, it's helpful for us to see that in that way. So not positive, but I'm guessing that that's the case. So moved by a sudden thought, I bent down and tried to pluck a daisy which was growing at my feet. The stalk wouldn't break. I tried to twist it, but it wouldn't twist. I tugged till the sweat stood out on my forehead, and I had lost most of the skin of my hands. The little flower was hard, not like wood or even like iron, but like diamond. So imagine that you are in this world today and you bend down to pluck a daisy and you have this kind of an experience with it. You can't pluck it, you can't pull it, you can't even move it, that it's so substantial, so hardened, that with all of your physical ability, you can't pluck a simple daisy. That's the nature of that world compared to ours. He goes on to say, there was a leaf, a young tender beech leaf. So if you know what a beech leaf looks like, it's a smaller leaf, lying in the grass beside it. I tried to pick the leaf up. My heart almost cracked with the effort, and I believe I did just raise it. But I had to let it go at once. It was heavier than a sack of coal. So this little leaf that he tried to pick up in heaven was heavier than a sack of coal. As I stood, recovering my breath with great gasps, and looking down at the daisy, I noticed that I could see the grass not only between my feet, but through them. I also was a phantom. Who will give me the words to express the terror of that discovery? Golly, thought I, I'm in for it this time. I don't like it. I don't like it, screamed a voice. It gives me the pip. One of the ghosts had darted past me, back into the bus. She never came out of it again, as far as I know. The others remained uncertain. Hi, mister, said the big man, addressing the driver. When have we got to be back? You need never come back unless you want to, he replied. Stay as long as you please. There was an awkward pause. This is simply ridiculous, said the voice in my ear. One of the quieter and more respectable ghosts had sidled up to me. There must be some mismanagement, he continued. What's the sense of allowing all that riffraff to float about here all day? Look at them. They're not enjoying it. They'd be far happier at home. They don't even know what to do. I don't know very well myself, said I. What does one do? Oh, me. I shall be met in a moment or two. I'm expected. I'm not bothering about all that, but it's rather unpleasant on one's first day to have the whole place crowded with trippers. Damn it. One chief object coming here. Yeah, sorry, damn it. One's chief object in coming here was to avoid all of them. So he from this point on, he continues to encounter a variety of people. And here's one person that doesn't want to go back, and he's expected. And his goal is just to avoid all these irascible people who are unpleasant to be around. He drifted away from me. I began to look about. In spite of his reference to a crowd, the solitude was so vast that I could hardly notice the knot of the phantoms in the foreground. So these people, the whole group of them, were virtually lost in the foreground that was in front of him. Greenness and light had almost swallowed them up, but very far away, I could see what might be either a great bank of cloud or a range of mountains. Sometimes I could make it out. I'm sorry. Sometimes I could make out in it steep forests, far withdrawing valleys, and even mountain cities perched on inaccessible summits. And so he's looking out this vast place and he's trying to get a grasp of where he is. The group of phantoms who came up on the bus are just virtually invisible in front of all of that. And so as his vision becomes clearer, he begins to see, faraway valleys, forests, and even mountain cities perched on inaccessible summits. At other times, it became indistinct. The height was so enormous that my waking sight could not have taken in such an object at all. Light brooded on top of it, slanting down, thence it made long shadows behind every tree on the plain. There was no change and no progression as the hours passed. The promise or the threat of sunrise rested immovably up there. This is very important because it's not daylight, it's dawn. And so in Greytown, it wasn't night, it was dusk. And these two things are working in concert with each other. And so he's talking about this mountain where he says, the height was so enormous that my waking sight could not have taken it in such an object at all. Light brooded on top of it, slanting down. Thence it made long shadows behind every tree and on the plain. There was no change and no progression as the hours passed. The promise or the threat of sunrise rested immovably up there. And so you get this sense in which he's alluding to the second coming or maybe even the second judgment. And so there's this light and it's ready to move forward, to move from dawn into daylight. And for some people, that's a promise. There's a fulfillment. And God's ultimate plan will be finalized and come to pass. But for others, it's a threat because in their unredeemed state, that light will not be good for them. That daylight. So if they're barely visible without direct sunlight, they would be those same phantoms would be obliterated in real daylight. You couldn't see them at all. There would be no hint, nothing would be left. So I think that's what Lewis is getting at here. Long after that, I saw people coming to meet us. Because they were bright, I saw them while they were still very distant. And at first, I did not know that they were people at all. Mile after mile, they drew nearer. The earth shook under their tread as their strong feet sank into the wet turf. A tiny haze and a sweet smell went up where they had crushed the grass and scattered the dew. Now, again, compare that to his experience. He couldn't even bend a grass blade when he stepped on it. He couldn't pluck a daisy. He couldn't pick up a leaf. His nature, his physical nature, was so insubstantial. But here are these people coming, right? Before he couldn't even disturb the dew when he walked through the grass. Here, the dew is scattered, the grass is crushed beneath their feet, and there are footmarks that are left. In fact, the ground shook when they walked. So he says, a tiny haze and sweet smell went up where they had crushed the grass and scattered the dew. Some were naked, some robed, but the naked ones did not seem less adorned, and the robes did not disguise in those who had worn them the massive grandeur of muscle and the radiant smoothness of flesh. Some were bearded, but no one in that company struck me as being of any particular age. One gets glimpses, even in our country, of that which is ageless, heavy thought in the face of an infant, and frolic childhood in that of a very old man. Here it was all like that. They came on steadily. I did not entirely like it. Two of the ghosts screamed and ran for the bus. The rest of us huddled closer to one another. So let me read this again because this is Lewis's picture of our, not only picture, but the comparison and contrast between what we are like here on earth, what we may be like in hell, and then you take that and you compare it to what we would be like in heaven, and that's the comparison and contrast. So remember, these are people who are man-shaped stains on the air that you would regard as not being nothing no more substantial than you would as dirt on the window pane. These are people, the whole group of them, that virtually disappeared when the main character saw in the foreground, but the background, the mountains and valleys and mountain cities, and that they were, they almost disappeared. You didn't have any regard for the whole group of them. They couldn't pick up a leaf. They couldn't pluck a daisy. They couldn't even scatter the dew. And then you compare them. I mean, they are so insubstantial, so barely perceptible. There's no light in them at all. And yet, when you compare them to these people who are now approaching them, compare what I just said to what I'm going to read. Long after that, because they were bright, I saw them while they were still very distant. And at first I did not know that they were people at all. Mile after mile they drew nearer. The earth shook under their tread, right? You couldn't even hear a person walk in a normal person walk then, as their strong feet sank into the wet turf. A tiny haze and a sweet smell went up where they had crushed the grass and scattered the dew, something that was impossible for this main character or anyone else there with him that they could do. Some were naked, some robed. But the naked ones, because of their purity, did not seem less adorned, and the robes did not distinguish in those who wore them, who did not disguise in those who wore them the massive grandeur of muscle and the radiant smoothness of flesh. I mean, we've seen that, haven't we? You go to a fitness center or whatever, and you see young men or young women who have this rounded muscle. They're massive. They're the very the essence of a vital life and health and all that kind of stuff. And you kind of wish that you had that yourself, that you could regain that if you ever had it. And so Lewis is likening uh, these bright people like them, even far, 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 far greater. And so the robes did not disguise in those who wore them the massive grandeur of muscle and the radiant smoothness of flesh. Some were bearded, but no one in that company struck me as being of any particular age. One gets glimpses, even in our country, of that which is ageless, heavy thought in the face of an infant, and the frolic childhood in that of a very old man. Here it was all like that. They came on steadily, and I did not entirely like it. Two of the ghosts screamed and ran for the bus. The rest of us huddled closer to one another. And so I'm going to end here, but I just want you to think about, to ruminate on this really phenomenal picture that Lewis paints of the comparison and contrast of our real nature now in comparison. And I don't see anything that's inconsistent about this with Scripture. I really don't. Um, I I think that our glorified state is as good as or better than anything that Lewis paints. And I think our real and actual spiritual state is as terrible as or worse than anything Lewis paints in this first chapter and the first three chapters. And that it's God's plan to restore us in all of our fullness, the way that we were supposed to be originally. And so we'll just end there, and then next week we'll pick up chapter 4. So I hope this has been helpful to you, and I would encourage you to share this, to like it. When other people come along and they look at this, if they see that you liked it, then that might encourage them to listen. And I just think this is such a wonderfully encouraging chapter in many respects. These are the possibilities that God has prepared and given to us. And so I think that all of us deep inside suspect what our real nature is and what our true nature is in comparison to the magnificence of what God has in store for us. So hope that this is good. Thank you very much, and you have a great day. Bye-bye.